person use of a pronoun. A singular second person use is an example where you're referring to someone else. You are a writer and you wrote that book yourself. There I am referring to someone else, but still using a singular pronoun. So when we get into the use of they, them pronouns for a singular person, that's where a lot of folks seem to find some confusion. I know that I largely was taught that they, them is a plural pronoun, that it is used to refer to multiple people. But it has, in fact, traditionally been used as a singular pronoun as well, just not as frequently. I know for myself, the main time I used they, them pronouns with a singular person was when I didn't want my parents to know who I'd been hanging out with. I didn't want them to know that I'd been hanging out with the people they told me not to hang out with. Who did you go to the movies with today? Oh, I just, went over there with them. I was very, very nondescript with those pronouns so that they weren't going to question who I was actually hanging out with. That's just one example of how they, them pronouns have been used as singular pronouns, throughout kind of our education and our upbringing. And we are more and more frequently seeing folks identify with they, them pronouns. They refer to themselves as they. They refer to themselves as them. They want you to do the same because that's where they feel they fit in society. That's where they feel they are most comfortable in how they want to present to you. And your brain may be kind of going crazy, going, that's just bad grammar. I can't get myself kind of wrapped around that. It just doesn't feel right when I speak that way. But Merriam-Webster actually agrees that they, them pronouns can be good for singular use. They introduced this limerick. I believe the tweet is from 2017. But if you're a stickler for grammar, prepare to be irked by the singular there. Though it seems a mistake, the position we take is if the word is in use, we don't care. So it is completely fine to use they, them pronouns as the singular pronoun when referring to an individual. And we just kind of wanted to clarify that and get that out there up front because that's usually where we do see the biggest hang up. I catch myself using they, them pronouns at times, and it's just, my brain still goes, you misspoke. You said it wrong. You're stupid. But I'm not. It's part of what's changing for us. It's part of what we see changing within our community here in Greensboro and within the folks that interact with us on a regular basis at the LGBTQ Center. And so if we can kind of get to understand that they, them pronouns are okay to use in a singular way grammatically, then it kind of helps us maybe also understand a bit more as to why someone might want to use they, them pronouns for themselves as opposed to the traditional he, him, or she, her. But to truly understand that, we've got to kind of delve into a bit of a deeper idea, and that is the idea of the gender binary. Does anyone here know what the gender binary is? Is that a term that's familiar for anyone? So the gender binary is the classification system that separates us out into two categories, man or woman. But when you really think about why that happens, why we're only in two categories, it kind of becomes a rabbit hole. As I look around the room, I see a ton of different physical characteristics that differ between people who are presenting in similar gender presentations. I'm seeing folks with glasses. I'm seeing folks with facial hair. See folks with broad shoulders, folks with skinny shoulders. And those are not specific to a gender. Yes, they are more common in one gender than the other, but they're not specific. There are always going to be characteristics that are there between both of the two main genders. So if we have that many characteristics that we all share, why put us in just two separate categories? And that's where the idea of a gender spectrum comes in. The gender spectrum is what many members of the LGBTQ community are largely aligning with right now. That is the idea that there is not just woman and man, but that there is a whole wide variety in between those two. And that each of our individual characteristics, whether it's long hair, facial hair, painted nails, unpainted nails, that's what makes up your gender presentation. And if you can combine some of those elements and that's where you feel most comfortable, then you may identify as non-binary. You may find yourself sitting somewhere closer to the middle of that spectrum as opposed to one of the farther ends. And when you do find yourself sitting a little closer in the middle of that spectrum, it can present some challenges for you because most folks don't. They do hear man or woman, male or female, and align with one of those. And so identifying yourself as non-binary is a challenge. They're looking at you like, why are you a man with lipstick? Why are you a woman with short hair? You know, but that's not who you are. And trying to get someone to understand that can be a very big challenge. But using they, them pronouns is one way to introduce yourself and get that conversation started, get that topic out there. You know, they, them pronouns are something that a lot of non-binary people identify very closely to. It's not that they're trying to buck the trends or that they want to be outliers in society. That's not their goal. Their goal is to be the same authentic self that you get to present to the world every day. They have not felt that comfort that you have felt in your body. They want that comfort. They want to know that the person they present to everyone they run into on a daily basis, that person is themselves, not some conglomeration of what people have told them they're supposed to look like. They just want the same freedom that you have. They want the same comfort that you have. And so when you think about a non-binary person and their journey to that understanding, it maybe helps you understand a little bit more about why they would pick they, them pronouns for themselves. You know, they have decided that using they, them pronouns is far more accurate. And that's how they would like to be treated. That's how they would like for you to treat them. And if you can do that, then you're just treating them as fairly as you would anyone else. You're not going outside of your comfort zone all that far. You're just offering the same respect you might offer to another person. The differences that make us who we are, you know, some of them are physical, but a lot of them are biological. And when you break down those biological differences, they are innumerous. I mean, there's just tons and tons of potential factors that can go one way or another to create a biological male or a biological female. There's a biologist named Rebecca R. Helm who's done a great series of tweets. I think it's 14 different tweets, and I'd be happy to share that with Miranda to share with the group here today if that helps after we wrap up. But Miranda goes through and asks, what would happen if you knew what your genes look like? You know, more than just your chromosomes, what gender markers are buried in your body that you're not even aware of, that your parents may not be aware of. You know, things that doctors don't think about unless there's a problem. There are just tons and tons and tons of different factors that happen on a molecular level as we develop from a fetus into a child that decide whether or not we are going to be a biological male or a biological female. And when you take all of those factors into consideration and try and sort out why someone will want to change gender or identify as non-binary, it can be overwhelming. It can be very complicated. It can be an easy way out to say, no, your biology is what defines your gender. But does it? That nature versus nurture debate is not yet decided upon. And I'm not a scientist, I'm not a biologist, so I'm not going to trip down that rabbit hole today with you. But I think Rebecca sums up that conversation quite nicely. And this is her final tweet that's here on the screen. Biological sex is complicated. Before you discriminate against someone on the basis of biological sex and identity, ask yourself, have you seen your chromosomes? Has anyone in here seen their chromosomes? I think I know what mine might be based on what science has taught me, but I haven't seen them. I haven't asked a doctor to show them to me or tell me what they are. Do you know the genes of the people you love? Have you looked around at family members and friends who you're close to and thought about what genes make them who they are? Probably not. The hormones of the people you work with. Hormones are a tricky thing. Men produce estrogen. I mean, it happens. It's part of what happens in biology. But estrogen is the predominant hormone that leads women to look like women. So it's not hormones that define your gender. Do you know the state of their cells? A cellular change can change the biological sex of a child. Biology is very complicated. Kindness and respect don't have to be. That's the main point of asking for pronouns. It's just about respect. It's about saying to somebody, I want to get it right. I want to know that you think that I can have a conversation with you without misjudging you, without mistreating you. I want you to feel comfortable to speak with me because I feel comfortable speaking with you. And it gets complicated. It does. You know, we admit that. The alternate pronouns that are coming out, a lot of folks identify with alternate pronouns because that's even farther outside of the gender binary for them. And alternate pronouns can create a level of confusion for a lot of folks. Truth is, alternate pronouns have been in use for a very long time. There are actually over 29 sets, I believe, of known alternate pronouns that have been used throughout the course of history, and these are just a few of them. It's not as simplistic as we've been taught to believe it is. I think one of the most interesting things I've learned in doing some of this research is that back in the turn of century in the UK, there was a scholar that came out with a term for referring to a group of people that you don't know. So they is referring to a group of people that you do know. Thon, T-H-O-N, would have been used to refer to a group of people that you don't know, someone that you're not connected with but are still talking about. You know, a simple example might be talking about a different sports group. You know, instead of saying they over there in Cleveland root for the Browns, and if you don't know anyone over there in Cleveland, you might have said Thon over there in Cleveland roots for the Browns. Thon was a word that scholars, authors, professors really thought was a wonderful addition to the English language. They thought it was extremely useful. It was a very well-received term when it was coined. But the public didn't pick up on it, and we don't use it. It's not a term that is in our lexicon right now. So it served a very, very important purpose, but because the public didn't want to use that, because it just didn't take root, we don't use it. And so it's kind of interesting to think about, especially when you think about alternate pronouns and how many other terms have been out there that people have used that have been very beneficial but didn't get picked up on widely. And you can kind of see in some of these alternate pronouns that there's just a pretty big variation. And you'll see here, Thon, sitting right there, third from the bottom. Thon laughed. That would be referring to somebody you don't know who was laughing. And so there's a wild history of alternate pronouns. The use of ze, zir is not something that is wholly new. It's new to us because we've grown up in a time when he, him, she, her, they, theirs were the pronouns we were set with. We were not introduced into alternate pronouns. You know, we all put each other into these categories and stayed there because that's what our language provided for us and that's where we felt comfortable. But a lot of folks have never felt that comfort. And a lot of folks have never felt comfortable saying they were uncomfortable. And what a non-binary person is doing when they introduce themselves with they, their pronouns is twofold. You know, it's letting you know that they do identify as non-binary, that they identify outside the gender spectrum. But it's also saying, hey, this is who I am, and it's a simple way of just saying, if you use these pronouns, I'll feel a lot better about getting to know you. And so we get a little deeper in here, and we get to the point that we want to start asking about how to use personal pronouns. I mentioned at the start of this that I like to introduce myself with my pronouns. Hi, my name is Melvy Shaw. My pronouns are she, her. May I ask for your name and your pronouns. That's one way of me saying, I'm going to use my pronouns. If you'd like for me to use yours, please feel free to just go ahead and share them with me. It's okay to share them with me. That's just one easy way that you can kind of introduce that into your conversational habit. Now, I will admit that it does get tricky. There are transgender people who have transitioned that feel they have earned the right to the assumed pronouns they receive. They have transitioned to the point that society largely refers to them with the pronouns that they would use for themselves. And asking them for their pronouns can take them back to a time when that didn't happen that was very painful for them. It can frustrate them. It can frustrate the conversation. It can make it very challenging. But do we stop using pronouns because of those situations, or do we continue to use pronouns in hopes that it just picks up widely, forgive me. And we at the center, we do introduce ourselves with pronouns at all times. We ask people for their pronouns. We want to get it right. And if we have hurt somebody by asking for pronouns, we respect that as well. You know, we listen to that concern. We take in that reaction, and we apologize. But we explain we ask pronouns of everybody because we don't want to make assumptions that are wrong. We don't want to look at a person and just, from their appearance alone, judge who they are. We want them to feel comfortable sharing themselves with us. That's the whole point of asking for pronouns. It is to, like I mentioned earlier, level the playing field. It's about leveling the playing field and just from the start kind of introducing a way to speak with people that can make it more comfortable. And given all of that, we see that it happens to ease the conversation. You know, if you've got a big group of people that you don't know, People have the opportunity to go around the room and introduce themselves with their names and their pronouns. It can set a tone for a conversation that's much more open, that's much more well-received. You are expanding the boundaries of what can be talked about in that conversation. You are expanding the boundaries of who can be involved in that conversation. You're opening the door for a much more comfortable conversation. And a lot of the conversations we have at the LGBTQ Center aren't comfortable. I mean, I'm sure that some of the conversations that happen here at Unity can also be uncomfortable. So when you're dealing with those heavy topics, trying to let folks feel as comfortable as possible heading into them is important. You know, it's very important. It goes a long way in making sure that that conversation holds its footing, that it's not just blown past or that people check out too early. And kind of given all of that, you know, we can get into the minutia of the different identities within the LGBTQ community. But using pronouns is one way from the start if you don't have the knowledge of just saying, hey, maybe I don't get it right all the time, but I'm gonna try. You know, you may hear a term such as asexual, and your brain goes into the science that you learned growing up. Well, how can humans be asexual? They can't reproduce without a mate. Asexuality means reproducing without a mate. Well, that's what it means for other species, but a lot of members of the LGBTQ community who identify as asexual, that definition has changed to fit their life. You know, to be asexual means to not necessarily find sex as the driving force behind why you want to build a relationship with a person. That the comfort you feel with that person in conversation, you know, maybe there is physical contact, but not sex. You know, maybe it's about the fact that you just haven't gotten there with your mate, and you may not. It's okay not to push it. You know, that's part of what being asexual is. And, you know, it's becoming more commonplace for folks to identify as that. You know, they just don't feel the drive to have that intimate relationship turn physical. You know, being comfortably intimate with a partner is important. And while asexuals don't often have a specific set of pronouns because asexuality refers to a sexuality rather than a gender, you can have somebody who is non-binary and asexual. In that case, they would use they, them pronouns. And that's why the pronouns are so important. And they can introduce a lot of information right up front. And from this point, going into a conversation with, say, a medical practitioner, it may become a bit easier to understand why using pronouns with a medical practitioner who you've not seen before can give that person a lot of information that they don't have based off your charts. You know, if you come in and say, hey, my pronouns are they, them, your medical practitioner is going to go, okay, so there may be some transition-related conversation here, but I'm not talking to somebody who wants to transition from male to female. They, them pronouns give that information up right away. To a medical practitioner who is well-versed in treating folks who want to transition, they, them pronouns can say a lot without the non-binary person having to go through and answer a lot of very invasive questions. They likely will still have to answer those questions, but if the doctor recognizes they, them pronouns and respects those pronouns up front, it's going to make it a lot easier on that non-binary person to answer those invasive questions. It's the same thing with someone who is coming in to specifically transition from male to female. You know, if they come in and say, hi, my name is, my pronouns are she, her, but they have not yet started a physical transition, it's a very big clue to that doctor that that's what this person is here for, and that that is going to be part of the conversation. It gives that doctor a piece of information that the forms later will, that the questions later will, but it's a very upfront introduction, and that doctor can then take that information and say, hi, thank you, ma'am, for coming in, and take them back and treat them as they want to be treated. It just levels the playing field from the start. And I had a video included as part of this that I'm going to leave off and just include it in the resources here since we don't have it set up to go out to the folks on the internet. But I do want to kind of take this moment and ask if there are any questions about pronouns up front. Yes? Sure, sure. So just to kind of reiterate, just to clarify, pronouns are actually the terms that we use to refer to somebody as opposed to their proper noun. And their proper noun would be their name. So my proper noun would be Melvy. My pronouns would be she, her. And an English teacher is probably going to pick me apart for that. I probably am not explaining that as clearly as I should. But yes, yes. So, but. Yes.
So, can you clarify a little bit? I see a lot of like she, her, or he, him, but then when it says she, they, or you, they,
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Certainly. So the question is about pronouns that may combine things that we don't typically combine, such as he, they, or she, they. And when you get into thinking about he, they, and she, they, you're probably talking to somebody who does have physical characteristics that lend a little further towards one end of the spectrum than the other, but internally they may feel that they're not quite there. You know, their presentation may be a little further towards the male end or towards the female end of the spectrum, but internally they are a bit more nuanced. They are a little closer to the middle, and either they are working on how to get their presentation to match that, or they are comfortable with the fact that their presentation does lend to the idea that they may be on one end of the spectrum and using he, they, or she, they as a way of communicating internally, I'm not the way that you may presume me to be. And again, that's just them sharing a bit of information with you up front. People's pronouns can also change. You know, as someone who starts a gender transition and maybe initially decides, I'm going to go all out, I'm going to have surgery, I need to be the opposite gender than I am now. But as transition starts, as they settle into who they are and find that comfort level with their presentation, it may be that a non-binary identity is where their comfort level truly sets. You know, it's not set in stone that if someone says, I am transgender, that their pronouns will follow he, him, or she, her. You know, someone who introduces themselves as transgender with the pronouns of she, her, but is still very early in their transition, may come back months or years down the road and have different pronouns to share with you, at which point in time they're simply sharing more information with you than you had the first time you spoke with them. They're saying, I've started a transition, but I'm finding myself very comfortable right here in the middle and may stay here for a while, may stay here permanently. And that's kind of what people who change pronouns may be going through. So, does that help? Any other questions specifically about pronouns? Excellent. And so I don't have another slide for this, but I did want to go ahead and bring up some of the other letters of the LGBTQ acronym. You know, we've talked a bit about non-binary. We've talked a bit about being transgender. We have stayed on one side of the LGBTQ equation right now. The LGBTQ community is made up of all kinds of different people. But one of the biggest confusing factors that we see at the LGBTQ Center are the differences between sexual orientation and gender. They are two very different things. You know, who you love and who you present as, they are not linked together. They are not strictly linked. Someone who presents as a man with he, him pronouns, who is gay, loves another man. But someone who presents with he, him pronouns and maybe is attracted to both genders is bisexual. Someone who is non-binary can also be bisexual. They may have some attraction to two specific genders. So sexuality and gender are not completely linked. They are different, which is why we have a subset of terms for each side. So sexualities are lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, all kinds of different orientations in which folks find themselves attracted to people in different ways. The gender language, transgender, non-binary, agender. Agender is someone who doesn't necessarily align with any specific gender and doesn't necessarily feel that they fit the traditional gender spectrum. So there's another level for you. That is specifically linked to gender and gender presentation. You know, who you are up here is your gender identity. Who you are inside is your gender identity. Who you present to the world is your gender presentation. Who you love is completely different. Who you are attracted to is completely different. That's your orientation. And so when we talk about folks who have different letters of the alphabet, kind of wrapped around themselves, folks who identify in different ways. It becomes a bit easier to see how someone who is gay may also identify as agender. You know, they may be traditionally attracted to males and have a bit of a more male presentation, but don't specifically have that connection to the male gender. You know, they can identify as agender on the inside, but still consider themselves gay because they only find that attraction to males who they tend to look more like. The term pansexual, is that one that folks are familiar with here? So the best way that I've heard pansexuality described is it's about the contents and not the package. And for a pansexual person, it's not about the gender presentation that they see in the person in front of them. You know, they are attracted to who that person is on the inside. Another easy way to think about pansexuality is that they're in love with the soul. They're not in love with the body. And one example of where that may come into play is you know, partners who have been married for a long time, but one switches gender and that relationship still survives. The partner that didn't transition may now consider themselves pansexual because they still love the person they've always loved and recognize them in a different presentation. And so that's where pansexuality comes from. Yes?
So is there, because I found that in wording out my understanding of pansexuality, it sounded awfully close to the same way I would define bisexuality.
And the difference between, so the question is, what may be the difference between bisexuality and pansexuality? And the difference between bisexuality and pansexuality is that bi is specifically two genders. You know, you may only find yourself attracted to a man and a woman and not find yourself attracted to someone who identifies with a gender that is not on the gender binary. It could also be someone who is in love with transgender people and people with a more feminine presentation. That can also be considered bisexual. Pansexual is all genders. You know, they see the soul, they see the person inside the body, they don't see the body as what they are attracted to. So it wouldn't matter which gender that person presents as. They still love that person. They still love that partner. And I think the most important thing to acknowledge when we're talking about people who are bisexual, pansexual, non-binary, these aren't people who are just waiting to make a decision. You know, it's not as if someone who identifies as bisexual, once they marry, they are no longer bisexual because they are linked to a specific partner. You know, bisexuality doesn't go away just because you've gotten married. Someone who's non-binary is not sitting in an androgynous presentation waiting to make a decision on to whether or not they're going to present as a man or a woman. That is where they feel the most comfortable. You know, that specific gender presentation is how they identify and how they want to share themselves with the world. And expecting someone who is non-binary or bisexual or pansexual to kind of come out of that as if it's a phase is what we refer to as erasure. You know, it's not acknowledging that that person is who they are. It's not respecting that their identity is valid, that their orientation is valid, that their presentation is valid. We see it as valid. We see all of it as valid. You know, we are not the ones who are going to make the decisions on how you should be treated. We want you to come to us and feel comfortable letting us know how you would like to be treated. And so that's where pronouns come into play. That's where a lot of the different letters of the LGBTQ acronym can really come together and start to treat each other fairly. And it's important to kind of acknowledge that. It's important to acknowledge that it's about leveling the playing field. It's not about someone challenging your reality or someone questioning your gender when they ask for pronouns. It's about them trying to find their place in this world and feeling comfortable in doing that. The same thing that you all feel without maybe not questioning it. And I'm not speaking for everybody here because I don't know you. Some of you may actually be questioning, and that's okay too. And that's what we wanted to bring into the conversation today, was this idea that all of these terms that are floating around that you may hear, that are up and out there, there's kind of an easy way to interact with those terms without feeling like you may get it wrong. And that's simply asking for someone's pronouns. Asking for someone's pronouns is just a way of saying, I'm trying to get it right. Now, I do want to make sure that we include ample time for Q&A. Miranda, do we have any questions coming in from the outside? Okay. Yes.
I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
When I hear it defined as both queer and questioning.
Yes.
Questioning, I understand. Queer is my question. If it's standing for queer, what's difference from queer versus the LGBT part of it already? Is there a difference?
Certainly. So queer is a very interesting term, and the question was, what does the Q stand for? You know, we understand that Q stands for questioning, someone who may be questioning their orientation or questioning their gender. But Q also stands for queer, and queer has a very wild history in this country. For a lot of folks, queer is still used as a slur. It's still used as a pejorative, a term that was used to harm people. You know, the Stonewall Uprising is largely where we see the term queer being used by this community to refer to themselves. So it's not as recent as folks want to think it might be. You know, it started back in the late 70s when the fight for equality for LGBTQ people was just kicking off. More folks started to pick the term queer back up so that it couldn't be used to hurt them. They started to identify with that term to let folks know who they were and who was coming. You know, they were fighting for their rights and saying, you know, you've called me queer. I am queer, and I want to fight for those rights. And so we see queer as being one of those terms, much like dude, that is picking up a new meaning in modern times. More and more folks are identifying with the term queer. And that can add to that layer of confusion, because where does queer stand out from the other letters? Queer is an umbrella term. It's a term that folks use because they maybe don't want to explain all of the nuance of who they are every time they introduce themselves. Queer can also be used for someone who maybe identifies with different letters of the LGBTQ acronym. You know, somebody who is transgender and a lesbian who doesn't necessarily want to share that right out the gate may just come up and say, hi, I'm queer. You know, that's a way for them to share that information. Folks who have different gender presentations and orientations from the standard will oftentimes align with the term queer. You know, that's just an umbrella term that's an easy way for them to share themselves with the general public. Does that help?
Yes.
Perfect. So to make it even crazier, there's another video that I will include with this. Queer is not a new term, period. It actually dates back into, like, I think, early 1800s Scotland. And there's a whole wild history of how queer was used by the rich to denigrate the poor before it was ever used when it was referred to orientations or to gender presentations. So queer is a term that's gone on its own little roller coaster ride and probably will change its definition again before it's settled upon. It's one of those terms that is adaptable, one of those terms that folks are finding different meaning in. So. Yes.
If you're interviewing someone, how should you ask the person how they want to be identified?
So if you're in an interview setting, again, you know, the way that I would do it is introduce myself with my pronouns first. You know, my name is Melvy Shaw. My pronouns are she, her. May I ask for your name and your pronouns. That's one way in which a person will feel comfortable introducing their pronouns into the conversation, at which point in time you could turn and say, may I ask a bit more about your identity? Would you share some more information with me about how you identify? You've kind of set the table there for a level playing field by asking for the pronouns up front, by telling that person you want to get it right from the start. So when you do ask them how they identify, they might feel a bit more comfortable giving that information willingly. Hopefully that helps. Yes?
At Greensboro Zoom meetings, we sometimes get a question coming from a parent who will say, why does she want to blah, 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 meaning publicly identify as transgender? And to those of us who've been around for a while, it's a no-brainer, but what do you say to a parent who is like, well, why would he want to do that? Or why would she want to do that?
Certainly. So the question was, why would somebody want to publicly identify as transgender? And I think that question, for those who don't know, it was Linda Stroop with PFLAG Greensboro, which is an amazing PFLAG chapter, asked that question and how it could be used in their support group. You know, I think that question is probably rooted in the knowledge that a lot of trans people are mistreated, that to identify as transgender is to walk into a society that's not going to accept you easily, that you're going to face harm, you could potentially face violence, and why would you want to publicly put yourself in that position? Well, the fact of the matter is they've probably always been in that position and never been able to express it. And to come out as transgender is a very, very terrifying thing because you do not know how anyone is going to react. For a long time, a lot of folks who transitioned wanted to go stealth, meaning they wanted to get to a point in their transition where the people they knew, the life that they lived, was not reflective of a past that they weren't fond of. You know, they would not explain to people that they had been born a different gender than they currently present as. They would let that past kind of fall away and effectively start life as a new person. That is something that still happens. Folks still find that comfort level in going stealth. But it's this day and age, I would like to think that it's less about the potential danger they may face as identifying as transgender and more about the personal preference of not wanting to live with the pain of the past. You know, so folks who go stealth, they aren't hiding, they aren't ashamed, they aren't afraid of being transgender, but the pain in their past is not something they want to carry with them. And so it's okay to respect that. It's okay to let yourself kind of acknowledge that. You know, someone who's stealth is not turning their back on the LGBTQ community and walking away from it. They're walking away from a personal pain that they don't feel like shouldering. Someone who is transgender is saying, hey, I've got to get to this point where I feel comfortable presenting, and I need people to help me get there. And so if someone comes out to you as transgender and maybe has not started a physical or a medical transition, that person is trusting you with some information there that it's up to you how you want to use it. And if you use it to hurt that person, you probably aren't going to see them again. You know, they're not going to feel comfortable coming back around and asking for help again. You know, more and more folks who have transitioned are feeling comfortable retaining the idea of being transgender. I myself am transgender. You know, it's not something I typically lead with, but it is part of who I am. It's not something that I hide. It varies for different people. And you know, for a parent who hears that from a child, you know, I think that fear is rooted in, I don't want my kid to be treated poorly or to get hurt. But the fact of the matter is if they don't transition, which is what they're sharing with you that they need to do, they may hurt themselves. You know, they're bottling up a lot of pain. They are bottling up a very, very hard life in having to force themselves to put on a happy face and go express themselves to the world as the person that they know themselves not to be. The act of transitioning isn't defiance. It's not saying, I don't like what you've made me. It's saying, I'm not the person you know me to be, and I can't fix that without undergoing a transition. And transition's not locked in stone. You know, there are different paths to get to a comfortable gender identity. Sometimes it involves medical transition. Sometimes when the medical transition starts and people start taking hormones, their brain and their body start to align. And where at first they may have wanted to rush into some surgeries, they now start to realize they're comfortable where they are and that surgery does not have to be the next immediate step. They may still have surgery down the line. They may still feel that this is the time to do it because they're young enough and they haven't maybe yet started a professional career, or they've got good insurance, and this is the time when they know it's going to be safe to do it without that money running out, without that insurance disappearing on them. You know, it's going to vary for each trans person. Each trans person is going to have to first come to the acknowledgement that transition is where they have to go to survive, where they have to go to be themselves in this world. And once you've made that decision, then the flood of what to do next comes. You know, do you rush out and see a doctor? Do you start to share this information with friends to see how they react, to see whether or not you're going to have the same support system you think you do right now? What comes next? And it's different for everybody. I have friends who completely shut themselves off from their families because they knew their families would not accept it. They knew that if they told their families that they were going to transition, there would be no support. So to get to the point that they could transition meant making sure that they were financially and personally capable of doing it themselves. I thought I was going to have to do that. You know, I grew up on a farm here in Greensboro, and when I left college and went to Los Angeles, It was in part because I had a film degree, and it was in part because I wanted to put a continent between me and my family on that farm. I didn't think they would accept me. And it was a long road before they did. But I'm back here in Greensboro, North Carolina right now because my family did accept me. I felt comfortable coming back and being close to them. I wanted them to be part of my life, and I wanted to be part of theirs. But that wasn't an assumption I could make from the start of my transition. I had to be in a place where I knew I could do it without family support if that family was not going to support me. But I also had to be in a position where I could leave the door open for them to come along with me. And as trans people come out, that's all they can really do. All they can do is give you the information about themselves. Where it goes from there, it's up to you. If there's a negative reaction, that's up to you to kind of sort out. All they have done is share information about themselves. And for trans people, that can be really frustrating because they want people to come with them. They want the people they care about to still care about them after they transition. But they can't control that. All they can do is put the information out there and take the next step when they feel it's time to make the next step. So that was a very long answer, but hopefully it got to some of the point. Good. Good. Yes. The I stands for intersex. And so intersex is an outlier term. Intersex actually is not specifically linked to gender or to sexual orientation. It is linked to biological sex. And if we go back to this tweet from Rebecca Helm, a lot of what Rebecca talks about in the preceding tweets are the characteristics that can change, that can leave a person either biologically male, biologically female, or intersex. The term for intersex prior to us using the term intersex was hermaphrodite. It's a very clinical term, but it grew into a term that was used as a slur. Intersex became a bit more of a reliable term, I guess is the proper way to say it. Again, not being a scientist, I'm probably not explaining this as well, but you know, when you think of the term hermaphrodite, a lot of times that referred to physical sex characteristics, you know, what was downstairs. Intersex also encompasses a lot of the biological sex characteristics. Hermaphrodite may have as well, I'm not positive about that, but the public perception was that if you were a hermaphrodite, you had physical characteristics that didn't match what a man or a woman would have. Intersex is the acknowledgement that our biology is crazy. And you know, yes, there are standard sets of chromosomes, of genes, of gender markers that lend towards what we view as man and woman, but there's also a whole subset of people where those genes and chromosomes and gender markers don't line up and don't match. And they themselves are intersex. They are not biologically male, biologically female. They are somewhere in the middle. And it's probably more common than we acknowledge. You know, a lot of intersex folks probably don't want to talk about that publicly. It's not something they have to share with someone who they're not going to know intimately. But that's where that term comes from. And a lot of folks ask, why is intersex included in the LGBTQ community? And the answer to that is that intersex folks oftentimes face a lot of the same challenges that LGBTQ people face. Right now, there is a bill in consideration in North Carolina state government that would criminalize a doctor's ability to give hormone replacement therapy to a patient under the age of 18, regardless of whether or not the parent consents. What's so insidious about that consideration is there is a caveat written into that law that protects the parents of an intersex child's right to decide that child's biological sex and gender. That parents of intersex children still have the right to put a child who is intersex through surgery at a very young age to physically alter their body before that child can really formulate a thought or even communicate. And that's a controversial thing. You know, I certainly don't want to look at any parents in that position and say it's bad for you to want your child to have a normal life. It's not. But I do think we have to, as a society, start to ask whether intersex people deserve the right to make that decision for themselves. And if we do decide that that's what needs to happen, then when? It's not going to be an easy conversation. It's going to be a difficult conversation. But the law that's in consideration right now is just one of the examples where there's still a lot of confusion around LGBTQ folks and intersex folks. You know, right now that bill is specifically hard and fast saying It's not the kid's decision, it is the parent's decision. The parents deserve that right. And that's where I find a problem with it, because I think that kid should have some say in it. That kid's gonna have a life that may not be congruent with the body that's chosen for them. Or they may have a life where that body is right, but the surgery didn't go well. You know, surgeries at a young age are not an easy thing to undergo. So when you're protecting the right for the parent to make that decision, you're kind of putting the kid in jeopardy there a little bit, at least in my opinion. And that is an opinion there. So I'll make sure I clarify that. So, yes.
A follow-up question to my earlier question. It's a lot of what you talked about, but also, I think some of these parents wish their child would not come out, because then the parents may be afraid they might be embarrassed because they might have to come out. In other words, well, you know,
Yeah.
they don't want to have to share with their close friends or with other family members that Susie or Johnny or, you know, is not exactly who we always thought. They don't, if the trans person does not want to be identified, that shall obviously be respected. But I'm talking about where the parent, as I say, does not want them to be out and talk about it. But I think embarrassment on the part of the parents might be a factor. Have you ever seen that?
Sure. You know, I mean, parents' interactions with their kids is multifold. And I am not a parent, so I'm not going to question parental instincts. I know that you know, when I came out to my parents, my mom's main concern was my safety. You know, how are you going to keep yourself safe living in Los Angeles and going through this without family support? And that was a very valid question for my mom to ask. Now, if my mom had turned around and looked at me and said, how am I going to tell your aunt that you are transgender? I would have looked at her and said, why don't you let me do it? It's my information to share, you know? But I'm an adult, and I was an adult when I came out to my parents. I was not a child. What I will say is that me coming to the realization that I needed to transition was not an easy thing to achieve. It was a very painful thing to achieve. It cost a lot before I ever even started spending money on it. It's not an easy decision, and me coming out as transgender was nothing more than a survival mechanism. It was me trying to say to myself, if I'm going to stay here, I've got to do this. And me saying to my family, this is who I am. I want to be a part of this family, but the information is now yours to do what you choose to with. And so for parents who maybe are embarrassed, I would encourage those parents to look at where it comes from within that child, because that child's not trying to embarrass you. That child's trying to stick around long enough to become your adult child. So. What other questions can I answer? Good. Well, I know we're kind of right up on the 12 p.m. line, but I do want to say that we are here as a resource for anyone in Greensboro and for anyone out there on the internet. Miranda will have my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us. Yes, go ahead.
Talk a little bit about the services Guilford provides.
Certainly. So our foundation and our LGBTQ center, the LGBTQ center is still relatively new. You know, we opened up 4 years ago, and with the pandemic in our current location, it kind of feels like we're almost stuck between starting over and picking up where we left off. But within the center, we have a clothing closet, we have a library, we have a resource wall, we have all kinds of space just to sit and be safe. So during the week when we are open to the public, you know, that's what we are. We are a safe space. We want folks to feel comfortable stopping by, getting a cup of coffee. If you're in downtown Greensboro and just need a place to prop up your laptop for an hour, we have free Wi-Fi. Come on by. We have programs that are targeted towards specific demographic groups. Coming up in November, on November 6th, we're actually doing a free name change clinic that targets the trans community, that is there for the trans community as a resource for anyone who is interested in learning more about what it takes to change your name legally in the state of North Carolina. We have programs for youth. We have programs for the aging community. Our Gay and Gray group is very active. You know, we still do walk and talks on a weekly basis. We have our coffee talks at the center for that Gay and Gray group. And when it's safe to do so, we'll go back to doing in-person programming as well. We do all kinds of different programming for just the general population as well. We have a new event series called Camp Out in partnership with REI, where we've been doing a camping trip up at Pilot Mountain and working with the North Carolina Park Rangers to take queer folks on a hike around Hanging Rock and talk about the different plant life, the berries, the foods that you could eat directly off the trail and what to avoid. Basically, you know, how you could scavenge if you were just out on a nature hike, what would be safe for you to consume. That group also does kayaking out at Lake Brant, which is a free event. You know, you can go and just get a kayak and paddle around on the lake for a little bit. Just paddle around and talk to folks. It's kind of a fun thing to do. The foundation, when things get to be a bit safer, we will probably resume some of our foundation-related events, which include Green Queen Bingo. Green Queen Bingo is the Southeast's longest-running drag queen bingo events. And it happens here in Greensboro at the Terrace. Well, it was happening at the Terrace. It may change locations to get, you know, accommodate more folks. But Green Queen Bingo is 400 plus people sitting around having fun, playing bingo, and just enjoying each other's company for a night while drag queens tell jokes and have fun. We also have a gala every year, which is one of our biggest fundraising events, and that's always a lot of fun as well. So the center itself is there for anyone who wants to use it, provided that they are offering LGBTQ affirming programming. We don't just reserve it for our use. We want third-party organizations to feel comfortable coming in using the space and, you know, making their programming and events LGBTQ affirming as well. We do have a community calendar, outandaboutgreensboro.org. We will post all of our events up on that community calendar, but it is also set up so that organizations can have a free account and post their events there as well, provided they are LGBTQ inclusive. We have an online resource guide in addition to our resource section at our LGBTQ Center. And you can find that on our website, guilfordgreenfoundation.org/guide. On that guide, you can search by location, you can search by category. But one of the nice things about being in Greensboro is that we are actually the highest ranked city on the HRC's Equality Index for the state of North Carolina. One of the reasons that we are ranked so highly on that list is because there are tons and tons of resources already here in town. There are doctors that are LGBTQ affirming, therapists, there's amazing support groups like PFLAG. There are trans vocal training speech pathologists that focus on helping transgender people learn to better use their voice and have it more reflective of who they are. All different kinds of things that are here in Greensboro that you can find out about in that resource guide. So. Yes. 121 North Green Street. So the question was about the physical address of the center. We are at 121 North Green Street in downtown Greensboro, basically at the corner of Friendly and Green across from Elon Law. You won't be able to miss our flag. So. Any other questions before we wrap up here today? Thank you all for the opportunity. Thank you for being here. We applaud you for participating, and thank you to everyone out there that joined us on the internet. Absolutely.